right, hi everyone. I'm here with Dr. John Walker. He is Associate Professor in the Anthropology Department here at UCF. He's been here for how many years?
Let's see. I came fall of 2006, so it's fall 7 years, I guess.
7 years he's been here, great. And I wanted you to meet John because I think he's done some really fascinating work, and he's one of the people around here that I think knows better than almost anyone the kind of intricacies of GIS work, which is stands, of course, for Geographic Information Software, or I think there's various.
Actually, there's a great discussion about that.
There's a discussion, exactly, yes. So what I'd like to do is, first off, John, if you could tell us a bit about your background, how you got into this, and all of that sort of thing, that'd be great.
Well, let me see if I can get this. I tell this story to my students I teach a course on GIS, 6181, Anthropology 6181, which is a GIS course that is meant more as almost like a studio. So I get students from a lot of different fields, not just anthropology. Occasionally, I'm trying to think of when I've had students from the humanities. I have to go back and look to check that out. But anyway, we welcome all kinds of students in that class. So I'm an archaeologist. I work in the Bolivian Amazon, and I study agriculture. And a long time ago, longer than I care to admit, when I was working on my dissertation project, I was interested in mapping and geography. And I thought, well, GIS would be perfect for me. It would be a great thing. I went to a conference, and I was very excited because the conference was very well organized, and there was a speaker who had on his extremely well organized piece of paper that said what he was going to say. There was doing GIS in what I think his words were the third world, or outside of the U.S. And it would have been a great conference for me, and I was really excited. And I said, "Wow, this guy's he's going to tell me how to do he's going to lay out my future. He's about to tell me what my future is." And he said, "Don't do this. It's impossible. You just can't. It can't be done right now." And I was crushed. I was totally deflated. And the good news is, though, that situation has almost completely changed. And the reason is the resources that are available to everybody in terms of satellite pictures and digital data, the census, and all kinds of sources of data that are freely available and even easily accessible in your own computer. That used to be either they required a whole lot of money or they required a whole lot of specialist training to use. So things have changed a lot.
So when we're talking about GIS, like what comes under that? It feels like an umbrella term for a bunch of different kinds of research, different practices, different tools. In your mind, what does it contain?
Yeah, and it is kind of a strange term. The dispute that I was alluding to earlier is a lot of people just think of it as geographic information systems, right? But there are many people who use this tool. I think we can call it a tool, that say, well, we've gone a little bit further than that, and we should call it geographic information science, right? So that there's more to it than just being a methodology. But it does come down, it is of course, very driven by the computer technology behind it. And it sort of comes down to a database, a way of organizing information where the spatial coordinates of every piece of information, that's sort of fundamental to the database. You can't have any information in it unless it's connected up spatially.
So would Google Maps or Google Earth be an example of this kind of thing?
Absolutely. That would be sort of like a front end of a GIS. And the reason that it applies in so many fields is that people are using that I guess this is not my field at all, but the sort of idea of big data, huge data sets that are out there that are connected up to maps are being generated all the time everywhere. Everything from police reports to the census to what different companies keeping track of where their stuff is. So lots of people are interested in it. Of course, a lot of people are interested in it because they want to find the most efficient way to get their stuff from point A to point B, that right on time kind of thing that I guess Walmart does. Or picture the police or the fire people want to get, they want to get things right where they need to be as soon as possible. Or you and I don't know if anyone still does this anymore, but the thing where you say, okay, I want to look up on my computer what's the quickest route between all the information that helps the computer make that decision is contained in the GIS. And answering those questions, like what's the quickest way to get from A to B, becomes a very fast question to answer. And that wasn't always the case before.
Now, they're not using Google Maps in your research field, in your research area down in the Amazon, are they? I mean, you're researching something totally different from...
Well, it's interesting, though, because one of the things that, when I was talking about accessibility, there was a day when I was in grad school when we got Landsat as a satellite that the U.S. government put up back in the 1970s. And they just cataloged this. Satellite's been up in the air ever since then, taking pictures. And because it's public domain information, but you used to have to pay $5,000 to get a scene, a picture. And then even when you got that, you got these strange, very specific kind of magnetic tape. So you needed to find a reader to get for a very strange format.
Right.
And then there was like a big manual that was about 200 pages thick of how to deal with the file. Right?
Wow.
So, but now that same information is the sort of default on, and it's available. I shouldn't make it sound like a commercial for Google, but Google Earth does have all that information up as the default for all around the world. So the same stuff that took, $5,000 a picture to get in those days, now anybody can access it. And of course, a lot of companies are very interested in putting their information up on Google Earth and other similar venues because they want to sell it to you.
Right.
So they're happy to give you some of it for free so that you can see how good it is.
Right.
And so in a way, we are using some of that information. The appeal for me, I work in Bolivia where we don't always have all the resources we'd like. And some of these resources, because they're free, let us have collaborations that otherwise we wouldn't have.
And how good is the data on a place like Bolivia? I mean, it's one thing to have great data on Manhattan,
right,
or something like that. But is it equally good? I mean, how close are the images?
Yeah.
Is it like 1 square foot type images or 10 square feet or what would it be?
No, to me that's an exciting question because first of all, there's the one level of they're taking more satellite pictures of Manhattan than they are of eastern Bolivia because more people care about Manhattan.
Right.
And my understanding is that on some of these tools, that's literally how it works. Like I think Google checks to see where people are clicking the most, and they make that a higher priority. But I think the thing that to me that's exciting is there's another dimension of the quality of data, and that's sort of maybe a more old-fashioned idea of I'm not explaining this very well, but it's sort of the question of where this river, is it in the right place or not? Or is the right label on this river, right? It's sort of a level that you don't have to worry about so much. But we're not that far away in eastern Bolivia from the times when there really weren't any maps that were I shouldn't exaggerate, but the maps were all made from remote sensing from things like aerial photos, and the people that had made the maps hadn't been there on the ground. And the exciting thing for me, for me in my own work, but I think maybe for GIS in general, is the idea that this idea of hooking up data to space or hooking up information to space directly is how you're trying to get the information that's in the head of a person who's lived in one place or who knows a lot about a place, get it out of their head and get it into a place where everyone else can see it. And that is a hugely powerful thing because, in my example, it's the knowledge of these archaeological sites or these agricultural fields or even things like, no, it doesn't flood there, or yes, it always floods there, or here's where I saw this animal or that animal. And that I would characterize that as local knowledge that you've got to go there to find it, right? And it's hard to get it any other way. And to me, that means all kinds of things that are interesting, historical knowledge.
Well, I was about to bring that up because it sounds, the way you describe it here, it sounds like, knowledge that would be a very immediate use to people that actually live in a place. But I know your research is not just about now, but about the past. I mean, you're in a certain sense trying to look at the traces of what was there before. Can you tell us a little bit about exactly what your project is?
Sure. I'm as I say, I'm an within anthropology. I'm an archaeologist, and so the people that I study them through the things that they left behind. And the reason, I guess you could say, the reason that I work in this particular place is because a long time ago, about 50 years ago now, a geographer was flying over it and saw these huge agricultural fields. And they were very visible from the air, but not so visible from the ground. And that was big news at the time. It sort of said, wow, there's a group of people here, there's communities of people here that farm and they build things. And previous ideas about the Amazon were that it was almost like a wasteland, a place where nobody could live because it was a difficult place to live. so we move past that, but now I think a really powerful thing is using that local knowledge or looking at the patterns that we can see in that on that landscape to study the people that made them. And the word I'm thinking of is a word that we pirated off of, I believe it's art history, the idea of a palimpsest. The idea, I think it comes from you paint something and then, oh, I changed my mind, and you paint over it, and you scratch things out and you paint over it, sort of like a chalkboard that you write on and erase.
Right.
And that is definitely what this landscape is like, and maybe all landscapes.
Yeah.
And so I see a big potential for GIS to look at that particular problem, that problem of what is a landscape and how do people move in it, use it, all those things. And sort of try and get a handle on the fact that it's not a snapshot. It's not like a map of a city and we know where everything went. It's the product of thousands, in my case, of thousands of years of people living there and changing things and messing things around.
Well, the palimpsest notion is an interesting one because you're right, it comes out of art history but also medieval studies. And the idea was that vellum or papyrus or whatever was quite rare.
That's cool.
And so what you did, especially if it was something like vellum, you might have something written there, but then you would want to use it over because you just don't have very much available. And so, I mean, in ancient studies and medieval studies, people are finding old texts. I mean, sometimes that's the only place we can find certain texts of ancient thinkers. So it was all about that. And the Earth is rare too, isn't it? I mean, as you look at it, there's we only got one of these Earths here. So it makes perfect sense to use the palimpsest kind of metaphor for this. Yeah.
No, that's very interesting. I've thought about that word or sort of used that word without knowing the part about it being involved with scarcity or the resource that you want to conserve. That's interesting.
Now, this is a digital humanities course, of course, and so I'm interested in what you might think about how some of this kind of technology or related technologies might be of interest to humanities students, to students of literature, ideas, history, art, a whole bunch of things of that nature.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of room for connections that historians can make, and historians in particular jump to mind because those are some studies that I can just think of right off the top of my head. There's a neighborhood in Philadelphia, which is a place where I lived for a little while, that was very important for W.B. Du Bois' study of African Americans living in big cities in the U.S. Right, as sort of a founding document for sociology, as I understand it, not exactly my field, and for African American studies and African American history, and so this was a study of a community of people in Philadelphia that he made a very exact set of records for, and you can go find that. I mean, of course, it's a neighborhood in Philadelphia today, and there are decades and decades of census information on it, and also a source of historical information, very, very precise maps that were made for the purpose of fire insurance. And in some ways, they have a lot more information than the census. It's sort of a different angle on the same place. But you can put all of those layers on top of one another. And sort of like the way that I don't think anybody thinks this, and no one uses this in classroom anymore. Transparencies were pieces of plastic you'd write on them, and you could show different things. So if you think of GIS as a bunch of different transparencies, one on top of another, it lets you coordinate or correlate different kinds of information. As long as you have it pinned down to a place, you can look at, wow, how did this change over from 1870 to 1970?
So you got both the spatial and the temporal happening here, because you could show neighborhoods of different people of different backgrounds and how they shift and change over time, and so that's fascinating.
Absolutely, and it's a place where people are living, right? So that you can say, well, let's go there, right? Or you can ask people, well, what do you think about this?
Right.
Did you know that this was like that? So, to me, being an archaeologist, the history connection is sort of instant, and it's sort of a seamless flow into that.
So this is an area that's probably pretty daunting for some people. I mean, people probably think that the tools you're using are, pretty high powered, take a lot of training, all of that sort of thing. Can you suggest anything that would be, a good entry level sort of tool or something that people could get into some of this and not have to, spend an entire term learning?
Yeah. No, I think that's a very important issue to think about. Because it's because GIS programs, they're big pieces of software, and sometimes they are really big and they're complex. they weren't all written with the end user
Indeed.
in mind. They sort of date to a time when fewer people were using computers at all.
Right.
But because it is such a huge, because spatial information has become so important in so many fields, there are lots of people thinking about this problem, and that's the people who are thinking about how to make your cell phone better, right, to help you find where you are, and I want to go have Chinese food, and boom, there it tells you where it is, right? So I think there's a lot more. Maybe the word is spatial literacy or something. People are thinking in that way a lot more. I think all of us with our devices are. And so things like Google Earth or Google Maps or lots of other spatial applications on the internet and on cell phones let you think about, what's around me right now, and how could I mark that? The camera you use on your cell phone, or a camera that can be linked up to a GPS, this device that gives you coordinates for where you are, so that photographs can be linked up. And nowadays there are a lot of different ways you can do that, so that people have collections of photographs that are up on the internet, and they're each connected up to a map. This is an interesting place, and then up on your browser pops photographs that everybody took on their vacation. Right?
Yeah.
It's I think there are a lot of ways to get into it, and in this GIS course that I teach, I spend a lot of time. Well, it sort of depends on the students, right? But there are certainly students to whom I have said, look, it's not a computer science class, and the important thing about GIS is to think about whatever problem you're interested in a spatial way, and that's a very powerful idea. Right. The analogy that I talk about that's on the cover of one of the textbooks is the guy who was a cholera epidemic, and he's looking around in London and seeing everybody's dying of cholera, and he makes a map.
I've heard of this one. This is a great one. This is a great one. Yeah.
Snow is the guy's name, and he looks at the map and he sees that all of the deaths are occurring around these pumps, and he says it's something in the water. And he basically invents epidemiology.
Yes.
He invents a new field by making a map of a problem. So if you have something that you're interested in history or philosophy or whatever field, and you can think of a way, well, how would I make a map of that?
Right.
Then I think that you're on your way to thinking in these spatial terms, and GIS can come later. GIS is it should be just a tool that, there I've taken sides in that argument. I don't mean to do that. After all, that idea of thinking spatially should be the goal, not any particular program, because the programs might be gone tomorrow. Who knows? Things change.
Do you mind showing us a little bit of stuff?
Absolutely, I would love to.
We're back in. Thanks. What do you have on the screen right here?
Yeah, let me show you a couple different things. First of all, let me show you some of the work that my students and I are doing and have done using the resources that are pretty widely available, things on Google Earth. And then maybe I'll show you some of the stuff on the other screen, on the other computer, where that's taken into one of these GIS packages. So let me try and explain what we're looking at here. These squiggly gray lines, you know what I should do though is let's turn it around and have it face north, and make it so that it's straight up and down, and we'll zoom out and then we'll zoom back in. So this is the continent of South America, and the big green blob that covers much of the northern half of the continent is the area that's drained by the Amazon River, and that's about as big as the continental U.S. So it's a big area. And my particular corner of the Amazon is this sort of diamond-shaped gray area here, which is a big seasonal swamp. Not so different from Central Florida, but in a different regime, such that it floods half the year and is dry half the year. And this town that we'll zoom in on here, is a place where I've been working out of for about the past 20 years. And it was founded in, I believe it's 1709 by Jesuit missionaries, and it just celebrated its 300th anniversary not long ago. And it is right in the middle of an area of these agricultural fields that I was mentioning. If we zoom in here, we'll see an area where this darker green is forest, and these little white lines, these little rectangles all around it, are the agricultural fields, raised platforms of earth about 20 meters wide by about 200 meters long. And what my students and I have been doing, my students right here in UCF, right? There's several different things that go on, right? We just got back from the field where we have been, where we spent the summer excavating and working. But one thing that my students are doing is tracing around those individual field platforms. And I guess you should never do a computer demonstration without rehearsing it first. But I'm going to see if I can show some examples of these field platforms. Those aren't real bright, but hey, those are not bad. Those little white tracings were made by students on their own computers using Google Earth, and we get together, a few of us every a couple weeks or so, and we discuss what we're seeing and how that process works for people. And it really lets students jump right into doing something in archaeology that gives them a feel for what research is like. And it produces a tangible benefit because we use these digitized fields to analyze the spatial pattern of this agricultural system and see if we can pose some interesting questions that then maybe we can answer when we go down there.
And how old would you say those fields actually are? I mean, how long ago were they used?
That's a great question, and it's a question that we try to answer by excavating in them. And we have a lot more luck when we excavate in those forests, these little islands of forest, as they're called. We find lots of evidence of people living there, the broken pottery, the carbon and burned wood from their fires, and that helps us get dates. So we have a lot more dates from the places where people were living, and we have to extrapolate out to the places where they were farming. But from those dates and from I have many excellent colleagues working in this part of the world, we think that people were farming this way well back before the time of Christ, well back into the first millennium BCE, I guess we would say, up through the time of the contact. So more than thousands of years of this kind of technology. And as a sort of a side note, one of the interesting things about this, about these agricultural fields today, this region is the economy of this region is really dominated by cattle ranching, which is a very extensive way of making a living. And the idea that raised field farming could be, let me wander up here and show you some other fields. The idea that this landscape once supported maybe 100 times as many people as live there today is based on looking at, the density and scale of these constructions. So the possibility that this could be an agriculture that could be used today, that's a possibility that since I'm not Bolivian and since I don't live there, it's not really for me to decide, but we can certainly present the information of, wow, here's a different way that people used to farm, here's a different thing that people used to do.
Is there any indication of what they would have grown?
Yeah, actually we have some pretty good information on that, and we always want more, of course, but to sort of make the long story short, it seems that there were a lot of different crops that were grown there. Root crops, things that are not so different from elephant ear, actually, which grows around here, and but also we're starting to see some evidence for corn, maize being grown there. There's also evidence of something called annatto or uruku, which is a red pigment that we use to make cheddar cheese look bright orange. But people in the Amazon we know lots of people in the Amazon use it as they mix it with an oil and use it to paint their bodies or to decorate things. And also ilex, which is a sort of a mild stimulant kind of a drink. So what I'm trying to say is that the agriculture seems to be very complex. Lots of different crops, not like a stand of a single crop, but many, many plants being grown. Probably very sophisticated knowledge of plants and what they can do.
And do you think any of this knowledge is maintained within the communities today, or is it mostly lost?
Yeah, well, that's another sort of million-dollar question. And one of the key points to make about that is that it is certainly the case that the descendants of the people who built these fields are the indigenous people of eastern Bolivia. But it is also true that there's no extant tradition of this kind of agriculture. The Jesuit missionaries who came turned out to be pretty good historical witnesses, so there's an interesting sort of historical story there. but they describe very little of this kind of agriculture. They talk about it in sort of side notes, but it doesn't seem that it was the system was really up and running at that time. So it's a very interesting question in how cultures change, and of course from the standpoint of history, it's a very the crucial time is probably between 1492 and say 1692, when Europeans came to stay and to live. So there's a long period of time when all kinds of things were going on. Diseases were moving around, metal tools were moving around, so that people's lives, and especially their agricultural lives, would have changed significantly during that period of time.
Cool. That's fascinating. Anything else you want to show us here? Anything else that's handy? Do you have any, or you said something about the
I could at least show you and in this respect, make a plug both for the GIS packages, but also for UCF, because UCF has, I probably should try to do one thing at a time. UCF has a site license for a program called Walker GIS, which is a very widely used GIS software package. This program's a little less user-friendly than the ones we were just looking at, but the same information that we get off of Google Earth we pass into this application, this computer, this program, and then we have, and here's an example of that, what I was saying, of a database hooked up to points or shapes on a map, so that basically any kind of information you can imagine putting into a database, you can connect up to these places on the map. Right? So the powerful example I would think of that maybe students in the humanities could relate to right away is the census. Right? The census is sort of, nowadays the census information is designed to be hooked up to things like this. So you could connect families, blocks, zip code, everything could be connected up in that way. So that, there's not that many analyses that you can do with Google Earth, but it's a sort of a front end or a way to look at information and also produce information that then you can analyze in a more sophisticated way.
And you say this is a tool that's available at UCF. By available, do you mean it's like the anthropology department has a license to it, or how does that work exactly?
It's a great question, because the university has a site license that covers the whole university.
Okay. And
my understanding from as an academic, I always think, wow, gee, that's a lot of money that you have to pay for that. And talking to some friends who work in who are consultants who work in engineering and outside the academic setting, they're like, wow, I can't believe they pay so little for that. So it's really a resource that UCF has that's available to students that otherwise I think it would be fair to say students wouldn't have access to, right? So I would encourage any student that has an interest to take advantage of those resources while they have that student
where would
designation.
where would you find the entry point to this? Like where is it located?
It can be installed on basically any computer on campus.
Oh, I see. Okay.
It may not be the case yet, but I think you could come and talk to me, or you could talk to some of the other people on campus that teach GIS.
Right.
And it can be installed on.
Right.
It's just because it's a large program, it's kind of a clumsy to install, so they don't have it on every computer that's possible to have it on.
Yeah. Cool. Well, your phone's ringing, so that must be a signal of some sort. So, gonna have a hard time editing that out of this, but students are used to it because my phone rings too. So what can you do?
Right.
So anyway, I think I'll let you go, but I really appreciate your being willing to chat with us. I mean, this is great, and I think you've given us a really good kind of picture of GIS today. So
thanks very much, and I'm always very happy to talk about the topic, whether it's on email or come into my office. I'm happy to talk about GIS.
Great, perfect. Well, this is John Walker, Anthropology Department. If you have any questions, he's happy to chat. So feel free to email him. Thanks a lot, everyone.
Thank you.